This is the very last chapter, Perek Chaf Bet, of Sefer Melachim Aleph. But what we need to remember is that the division of Melachim, of the books of Kings, between 1 and 2, is really more a function of trying to manage a massive book and divide it into two manageable parts, as opposed to any major shift in terms of its approach, in terms of its goals, in terms of its authorship. All of it is one unit. We find this happening, though, dividing books like this, even in later Sfarim. For example, in Shas, we have the Bavas, which Bava means gate. It's what contains most of the laws of damages. We have Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, which really means the first gate, the middle gate, and the end gates. And all of them were one, but they're just too massive. And so we divided them up into nice, reasonable sizes. And the same thing happens here. It's an interesting piece for those who are familiar with the series called Dat Mikra. This commentary actually on Melachim was written by its major editor, Yehuda Kil. He actually divides the two parts. He has a first volume of Melachim and a second volume of Melachim. But in the middle or towards the end of this chapter, he starts the second volume. He's making a statement by that as well. I'm reaching out to his son to get a little bit more background on that as well, to make sure I'm reading it correctly of why he divided it that way. We are at the end of the era of Achav. Achav is married to Izebel, if you remember. We've had a number of different Nevi'im who have encountered Achav, the most significant of whom was Eliyahu HaNavi, but who is going to be now off to the side for a little bit. And we have Achav continuing towards the end of his reign. In the previous Perek, we had talked about Achav's great victories and his continued move, but at the very same time, the curse that he received, and the curse that he would be killed, but he did Shuvah at the end, and therefore he's going to be granted a reprieve, and the next generation are the ones who are going to experience the end of the dynasty. At the very same time, we know that there had been a battle with Aram, Damascus, and Achav had come out victorious. The king had promised that he would be returning the lands that had been captured by his father. This goes back into Perek Chav. And yet we're going to see that that wasn't precisely the case, even though there may be some technical reasons why he didn't return them when he did, and not just purely the classic political of, let's see if I get caught or not. So Perek Chaf Bet opens with the words, Vayeshvu shalosh shanim, ein milchama ben Aram uven Yisrael. There are 3 years, and because, the Ralbag says, because Achav had done the tshuva, he's granted a reprieve of 3 years from war. There is no milchama, but as you notice from this opening pasuk, the primary enemy is Aram. It's even when you say that there are 3 years of peace, there's no war between Aram and Yisrael, that means clearly that we're expecting a war with Aram. Vayhi b'shana shlishit. And it was in that 3rd year. Now the question is, the 3rd year to what? It could be the 3 years of reprieve, and it could be from the very same point of when Achav had sent Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, into freedom. So could he be there similar, not exactly the same time frame, but it could be, and it could also explain, and this is probably where Rashi is coming from when he says that it's from Perek Chaf, the end of the Perek, when he sends Ben-Hadad, if you recall, he refers to him as Achi, my brother, and he sends him off. It would seem to make sense for the very same reason that why you said that they lived for 3 years in peace and it was in the 3rd year. It's a little repetitive, and maybe it means it's counting from a different point, which is Rashi's point. Vayered Yehoshaphat melech Yehuda el melech Yisrael. And Yehoshaphat goes down to the king of Israel. Now, why is it meaning he's going down? Well, he's going from Yerushalayim to Shomron. Whenever we go to Yerushalayim, we go up, Aliyah l'regel. Geographically, we also go up. And yet here, when he is going from Yerushalayim to the northern kingdom in Shomron, it's a step down, geographically and also spiritually. He's going there and he's trying, and Yehoshaphat is this great king, most of whose story is really contained in this book of Divrei Hayamim, but he's this great king who's trying to bring back relationships. interestingly, according to later on in Melachim Bet, we find out that that Yehoshaphat and Achav were actually mishpacha. That Yehoshaphat's son, Yehoram, married the daughter of Achav, and according to Chazal, there is also a medrash that Yehoshaphat had married Achav's sister. In other words, Yehoshaphat is either the mechutin or the brother-in-law of Achav, and so there is this relationship between the two, even though we don't see this relationship as being the driving force, but rather, based on Divrei Yamim, Yehoshaphat's great expansion of trying to understand and bringing justice and bringing people together again. In many ways, Yehoshaphat, based on Divrei Yamim, has many things in common with Shlomo HaMelech, the sense of justice that he restores to the kingdom. He himself goes around and appoints judges to make sure there is justice. The amount of idolatry that he'll remove, that'll be mentioned briefly here. All of the various things. Even he has this large tefillah that is offered to God as well. Vayomer Melech Yisrael el Avadav. Now, prior to this discussion with Yehoshaphat, there was a conversation between Achav and his servants. Hayadatem kilanu Ramot Gilad. You know that we have this area called Ramot Gilad. Ramot Gilad is in Transjordan. We first encounter it in the Sefer Dvarim, but it is an area in which we know that the 2.5 tribes had created for themselves a major city, and at the very same time, it was one of those cities which had been captured from the Jews by Aram. Va'anachnu machshim mikachat ota miyad melech Aram. And he says, at this point, we are holding off. We haven't been able to bring it back. We're holding back from trying to get it back from Melech Aram. Now, interestingly, Ben-Hadad had promised that et kol ha'arim asher lakach avi me'et avicha ashiv. He had promised back in Perek Chav that he was going to return all of the things, all of the cities his father had captured from the Jewish people. That's the simple approach. The Radak wants to explain why Ramot Gilad wasn't captured, and he says that actually Ramot Gilad may have been captured beforehand. And so Ben-Hadad is relying on technicality, and as a result, he didn't return it. He wasn't trying, in essence, to provoke Israel, who were the dominant force at this point and had decimated his army, but rather what he is just doing is he's sticking to his word and nothing more. And that's why Achav hasn't gone to war with him. But now Achav sees when the southern king, when Yehoshaphat is coming to him, he sees an opportunity. Vayomer el Yehoshaphat, hatelech iti lamilchama Ramot Gilad. Will you go with me to war to capture Ramot Gilad? Vayomer Yehoshaphat el Melech Yisrael, kamoni chamocha ka'ami cha'amecha kisusai kisusecha. Yehoshaphat says, we're one in this. Now, the way he explains it, kamoni chamocha, he says, listen, we are mishpacha. This is the Malbim's approach. We're mechutanim. Ami amecha, we're all Jews. Susi kisusecha, your horses, my horses are like your horses, means that we're going to enter into this alliance that will be beneficial to me as well. Just like you're helping me, I will help you. And he says, but he does say, Vayomer Yehoshaphat el Melech Yisrael, Yehoshaphat turns and he says, wait a second, Darashna chayom et dvar Hashem. You want to go to war? Well, let's go to war like Jewish people go to war. Let's check first with the prophet. Now, chayom, in this case, today, it also has this implication, the Mitzudot says, that normally this wasn't the approach that Achav would have taken. In other words, that what's happening right now is Yehoshaphat is injecting his sense of religion, his sense of propriety of religion into this conversation, which was beyond where Achav would have been. Both Melech Yisrael et Nevi'im. And so Achav gathers together all the Nevi'im, K'arba ma'ot ish. There were 400 of them. Vayomer alehem, and he said to them, Ha'elech al ramot gilad milchama im echtal. And he said, should we go against to war or should we stop? Now, first of all, this number 400 should ring a bell because back at Har Carmel, when there was the great showdown with Eliyahu, there were 400 Nevi'ei Baal. But these aren't necessarily the same Nevi'im. And yet the number 400 is just a massive number of possible Nevi'im. And the Radak says these were Nevi'ei Baal and Nevi'ei Asherah. They were prophets to idolatry. What's interesting is that if they were prophets to idolatry, why doesn't Yehoshaphat say anything? Mm-hmm. And according to the Radak, he says, listen, he didn't want to insult. He didn't want to in any way impugn the honor of Achab, but he was wrong. The Malbim says a very different way. The Malbim says, wait a second. If he's not saying anything, these must be Nevi'im. So who were these Nevi'im? These Nevi'im have to be something. But they are ultimately, these are the Nevi'im who were not killed by Eliyahu. They are still false Nevi'im. And in fact, Targum Yonatan says, Nevi'ei Shikra, that they're Nevi'ei Sheker. And we'll see why in a moment. By Yomru Alei. And all of these 400 prophets say, let's go up to battle. And ultimately, God will place this person in their hands. In other words, you will be successful. By Yomer Yehoshaphat. Yeah, sorry, Yafa.
Didn't Eliyahu kill the Nevi'ei Baal?
Right. So these must be 400 who were there at Carmel, but the Malbim suggests there must have been others as well. And remember, Eliyahu didn't kill the Nevi'ei Asherah because they weren't there. Izeva, we had proposed, had kept them back.
Can you tell me what the Malbim says again?
What Malbim says is these were Nevi'ei Sheker, ultimately, who weren't killed by Eliyahu.
These were other Nevi'ei Sheker.
Other Nevi'ei Sheker weren't killed by Eliyahu. Now, ultimately, we know the Nevi'ei Sheker for one simple reason. Vayomer Yehoshaphat ein po navi lahashemod. Yehoshaphat says, isn't there a real prophet here? Don't we have a God prophet? V'nidrasha meito. Let's ask it. Now, there is a very interesting piece on this. Rashi explains, how does Yehoshaphat know for sure these are false prophets? And he explains that we have a principle that no two prophets ever prophesy with exact language. To have 400 people say, Alei v'yiten Hashem biyad hamelech, is impossible. It just doesn't work. It can't possibly be. And by the fact that they all answer together, must be that they're false. Now, what's the reasoning behind this? If you look in the Rambam, when the Rambam talks about prophecy, he talks about the typical prophecy from the Nevi'im, where they received some form of dream. But the words and the way they express it are their own, which is why the way Yirmiyahu speaks is different than the way Yechezkel speaks. The way Yechezkel speaks is different than the way Yeshayahu speaks. They all have their own language in which they communicate their vision and their prophecy. The only one who received prophecy, which was a prophetic dictation almost, was Moshe Rabbeinu. As a result, if you think about it, if 400 people say the exact same words, it's been practiced. It isn't what they heard, it's what they agreed to say. And that collusion by itself is sufficient to say this is false. So isn't there anyone? Vayomer Melech Yisrael el Yehoshaphat. So the king of Israel says to Yehoshaphat, and notice throughout Achab is referred to as the king of Israel. Od ish echad, there is one. Lidrosh et Hashem ito v'ani sanetiv. Who I can ask, but I really hate him. Ki lo yitnabe alai tov ki imra. He is only going to prophesy evil against me. He never says anything good about me. Michayahu ben Yimla, and his name is Michayahu. Vayomer Yehoshaphat al yomar hamelech ken. And he says, whoa, don't talk like that for a minute. Now, what happens here is there are more than one prophet. Remember, Eliyahu was still alive.
Mhm.
But this is the prophet who was more attached to the monarchy. We've encountered Michayahu before. And he says he only speaks evil of me. He was the one we encountered when Achav went against Aram the last time and did not kill Ben-Hadad. So he's saying he's the one who's involved in this case. He only has bad things to say about him. And in that kind of case, he is saying, I don't want to talk to him. Interestingly, Abarbanel says, wait a second, he did speak nicely about him at one point, but Achav only remembers the bad and doesn't remember the good. When I was in college, I had a political science professor. Some of you may remember the name Milton Rakoff. He was an urban political scientist. He was at the University of Illinois, very close to the Daley family. And what he always used to tell us was the first rule of politics, Rakoff's rules of politics, was that a politician does as little as they can about as much as they can for as long as they can, because people only remember the bad and forget the good. And so the idea is every time you do something, somebody's going to be happy about it, but somebody else is going to be upset about it. The person who's happy, at the end of the day, he thinks it's coming to him anyway, so he isn't going to appreciate it. The person who's going to be upset about it won't forget. And so you don't forget the bad things. And I'm not trying to justify Chas v'Shalom Achav, but to understand how we can ignore what Michayahu had said before. Well, he can ignore it because it's human nature to ignore it. And the most recent encounter with him was that evil piece. Al Yomar HaMelech Cain. Okay, ultimately what Yehoshaphat says to him, wait a second. We're not looking for somebody who's going to be talking on his own. We're looking for somebody who's going to have prophecy. So you might say this guy only has it in for you, but I don't care what he says. I care what he hears. I care about his prophecy he's going to receive. And as a result, don't say that he's not good for it, because if he's a prophet, it's who we need. Vayomer Melech Yisrael El Sarisachar, and so he tells, Achav tells one of his servants, Vayomer Maharam Michayahu ben Yimla, bring him quickly, bring Michayahu here. Umelech Yisrael v'Yoshaphat Melech Yehuda Yoshvim Ish al Kiso Melubashim B'Gadim B'Goren. And the two kings are sitting in this assembly. A goren is a threshing floor, but a goren is also the description of how the Sanhedrin would sit. They would sit in a semicircle. They're sitting in this royal way. They are dressed. What kind of dress are they wearing? The melubashim. According to the Mitzudat David, they're wearing their regal garments. According to the Marikra, they're already in battle armor. They're already ready to go to war. They're dressed for an event. Petach Shar Shomron, right at the opening of the gate of Shomron, that's where the great meeting places always were. And all of the prophets are attempting to receive prophecy before them. This is an event that is taking place. Vayaz Tzidkiah ben Kena'ana Karnei Varzel. And one of those false prophets made for him horns made out of iron. Now, I imagine almost this event almost like a Viking hat. Vayomer ko amar Hashem be'ele tinagach et aram ad kalotam. With these, you will gore Aram until they are destroyed. Why Karnei Barzel, though? What's the significance of these horns? So the Abarbanel points out that Achav was from Shevet Ephraim. And as a result, if you remember, back in the time of the Chumash, Bechor Shoro Hadarlo Bekarnei Re'em Karnav Behem Yenagach Amim. The bracha that was given to Ephraim was the bracha of an ox. They were going to have the Karnei Re'em. Re'em, according to some, is a unicorn. That will be, but generally it's the kind of a goat. Okay, are there an onyx? I think is the name of it. But it's the kind, the horns are going to be, and they will gore their enemies. This is, in essence, the way Tzidkiah is trying to explain, hey, this is the special piece. And this is how you're going to win. V'chol hanaviim nib'im kein limor alei Ramot Gilad v'atzlach v'natan Hashem biyad hamelech. And all of these prophets are saying, go, go, you're going to win, you're going to win. V'hamalach asher karali kro Michayahu diber elav lemor. And the messenger who had been sent to bring Michayahu had told him, Hinena divrei hanaviim pe'achad tov el hamelech. Listen, Michayahu, everybody else is speaking positively about the king. Everyone else is assuring him he's going to win. Yehina dvarcha kidvar achad mehem v'dibarta tov. Why don't you talk just like they are? Speak good. He's setting up, he's trying to be able to make sure that he's going to give the right message to the king. Vayomer Michayahu chai Hashem. So Michayahu responds, listen, I'll take an oath. Ki et asher yomar Hashem elai oto adaber. I'm sorry, the only thing I'm going to be able to say is what God tells me to speak. Vayavo el hamelech vayomer hamelech elav Michayahu hanelech el Ramot Gilad melchamayim nechdal. And so he asked the very same question to Michayahu, the question that Yehoshaphat, the king of the south, had hoped he would be asking. He said, should we go in no? Vayomer elav alei v'atzlach v'natan Hashem biyad hamelech. He repeats the exact words that the other prophets had given. But if you notice, he doesn't say this is what God has said, but rather Rashi suggests this is a bracha he's giving. May you go up and be successful. The Radak, however, says this is a mocking phrase. He is specifically using the words that the other prophets have done, but the way he is saying them is to mock. Yeah, why don't you go up? You're going to be really successful. The idea going back to, if you remember, there's a famous phrase in the Chazal, mipi sofrim v'lo mipi sfarim, that if you want to understand something, you always want to look at the way it's being spoken as opposed to the way it's being written. You can lose the inflections in the written word. So the Radak says he's mocking him at this point, not something that he necessarily picks up immediately. Vayomer elav hamelech ad kama pamim ani masbiacha asher lo tedaber elai rak emet b'shem Hashem. And at this point, the king says, Achav says, it's not once, not twice, but I want you to swear to me that you're telling me this in the name of God. Vayomer re'iti et kol Yisrael nefotzim al ha'arim. And so now Michayahu gives the real prophecy. He sees all of the people of the north scattered among the mountains. Katzon asher ein lahem roeh, like sheep without a shepherd. Vayomer Hashem lo adonim la'ele yashuvu ish levato b'shalom. And Hashem says, to these sheep I see, we have no leader, and everyone needs to return to their homes. Now, when he hears this, obviously this prophecy, Vayomer Melech Yisrael Yehoshaphat, Halo amarti elecha, lo yitnabeh alai tov kimra. Achav says, I just told you this was going to happen. This person is never going to be able to say anything good about me. Okay? He's not, again, speaking with God. This is just because he hates me. But this is the prophecy of Michayahu. Vayomer lachein shema dvar Hashem, ra'iti et Hashem yoshev al kiso, v'chol tzva shamayim omed alav mimino mismolo. And he says, Michayahu says, if you want to understand, you're questioning what I'm saying, let me tell you precisely what I saw. I saw God sitting on his throne, and all of the hosts of the heavens are standing in front of him to the right and to the left. Vayomer Hashem miyifatet achav vayal v'yipol beramot Gilad. And he's saying, and Hashem says, who is going to trick Achav to go to war against Aram so that he'll die in Ramot Gilad? Vayomer ze b'cho v'ze omer b'cho. And each of the Melachim around are giving their suggestions. This is the way you should do it. This is the way you should do it. In other words, Michayahu is giving us a window into his prophecy. And in that prophecy, he's seeing these different things. Vayetze haruach vayamod livnei Hashem, and the wind comes forth. Now, who is this wind that's coming forth? Rashi says it's the spirit of Navot, the person that Izebel had killed so that Achav should have his vegetable garden right by his other home. The Radak says, based on the Tosefta, and he quotes it as follows, V'nafak rucha the Navot, that the spirit of Navot came out, V'kam kadam Hashem, and he stood before God, Ve'amar, Bebaum minach, I ask of you, Yitkam l'daman, will you please find nekama, vengeance for my blood? Vayetze ruach, back into the pasuk, Vayamod livnei Hashem, Vayomer ani afatenu. The Spirit says, I will trick him. Vayomer Hashem elav b'ma. And God said, how? Vayomer etzei vayiti ruach sheker b'fi chol neviav. And he says, I will go out and I will be the falsehood in the mouths of all of his prophets. Vayomer tefatev gam tuchal tzei v'asechen. And God gives the instruction to this ruach, to the Spirit, and says, go for it. And Michayahu tells Achav, and this is what has happened. God has placed this Ruach Sheker, the spirit of falsehood, in the mouths of all of your prophets. Vashem diber alecha ra'ah. God is the one who is speaking against you. It's God. It's not me. You think this is from me, this is from God. Interpret it as you want. But this is what I saw. My interpretation is, you're going to die. Don't go. Vayigash Tzidkiyahu ben Chana'ana, and the false prophet, Tzidkiyahu, steps forth. Vayaket Mechayahu alalechi, and he punches him in the chin. Slaps him in the chin. He punches him in the chin. Vayomer eze avar ruach Hashem me'iti ledaber otach. He said, how is it possible? Who is this person who's speaking in such a way? Vayomer Michayahu imcharo ebayom hahu asher tavo cheder b'cheder lehechavei. He says, you're going to see at that day, that on that day of war, you'll ultimately see that because of what's happening, you're going to go into hiding. Because your life is going to be threatened. Another possibility, Yehuda Kiel says that he saw this actually in a prophecy. Vayomer Melech Yisrael kachet Michayahu v'shivehu el ha'amon sar ha'ir. Take him to Ammon, the head of the city. Vel Yoash ben HaMelech, and to Yoash, the son of the king. In other words, grab him. Bring him into the city. Don't bring him there, okay? And ultimately, the Radak says that this was where the jail would be. Ve'amarta ko amar Hashem, simu et ze beit hakela. Put him in jail. Ve'achiluhu lechem lachatzu mayim lachatzu ad boi v'shalom. And just give him a little bit of water and a little bit of bread. Just keep him alive until I come back peacefully. Vayomer Michayahu im shov tashu b'shalom lo diber Hashem bi. And so Michayahu says to him, if you come back alive, God hasn't spoken to me. Ve'yomer shimu amim kulam. And he says in these words, Michayahu ends his prophecy by saying the nations will hear what has happened. That's Michayahu at this moment. Vayal Melech Yisrael v'Yoshaphat, Melech Yehuda Ramot Gilad. And the two of them now go to war. Vayomer Melech Yisrael Yoshaphat. But Achav then turns to Yoshaphat and he says to him, Hitchapes uvova milchama, v'ata lavash begadecha v'yitchapes melech Yisrael v'yavo b'milchama. He says that ultimately, I'm going to disguise myself. You wear your clothes, and I'm going to disguise myself when I go to war. Why is he suggesting to disguise himself? Because he knows quite clearly that he is going to be the object of the enemy. He's going to try to make sure that they don't see him. Umelech Aram tzival et tzarei harechav asher lo 32 lemor, and the king of Aram told his elite force, Lo telachamu et hakaton ve'et hagadol ki im et melech Yisrael levado. Don't bother with any of the soldiers. Just go for the king. Et melech Yisrael, because he understands. In this case, according to the Malbim, he had Ben-Hadad actually had spies in the northern kingdom who told him of the prophecy and told him that Achav is not going to get out of this war alive. However, the Daf Mikra says it's not necessary to say he had spies. It's entirely possible that this is just a normal tactic of war. You kill the general, you know that the people will both be demoralized, and at the very same time, they won't have any direction. So if you want to win the war, kill him. Vahi kirot sarei harechev et Yehoshaphat. Now when his people, when the Aramean people saw Yehoshaphat, vehema amru ach melech Yisraelu, and they said, this must be the king. Vayasur alav lilachem v'yizak Yehoshaphat. And they're getting ready to fight him, to kill him. And all of a sudden, Yehoshaphat yells out. Now, who is he yelling to? Rashi says he's yelling out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to save him. The Mitzudat David says he's yelling out to his people to come help him. The Radak says he yells out to the people from Aram because they know him. And they'll recognize his voice and they'll realize he's not Melech Yisrael. Vahi kirot tzarei harechev ki lo Melech Yisrael hu. And therefore, when they see that he's not really the king that they're after, veyashuvu me'acharav, they turn away. Ve'ish mashach bakeshet l'tumo. At that time, there was a person drawing his bow. Now, who was the one drawing his bow without really a target? According to Rashi, it was Naaman, who was the general of Aram, and he's referred to in Melachim Bet as an Ish Gadol Lifnei Adonav, and so this is the Ish. According to Rabbi Yosef ibn Yachya, he suggests that this is the Ish in the group, that this was actually Yehoshaphat. That Yehoshaphat, when he's about to be attacked, pulls back his bow and shoots somebody, and is unaware that who he is shooting. Vayaket Melech Yisrael, and he hits Achav. Now, it's according to Rav Yosef ibn Yachya, what it means is this is friendly fire that brings down Achav. Ben hadvakim uven hashriyan, and he hits him specifically in the place of the armor where the arrow is able to shoot. He doesn't hit any of the scales of the armor, but he gets him right there. V'yomer l'rakavo hafoch yadcha v'hotzi'eni min ha'machane ki hachaleti. Achav recognizes that this is a serious blow that he has now suffered. He tells his chariot driver, turn around, I'm not feeling well. Hachaleti, he doesn't tell him that he was hit, because if he tells him he was hit, everyone will know that this is bad news. Rather, he's not feeling well. He's a little chariot sick, maybe. Turn him around, and let's go a little bit out. And this war continued, and it went up, okay, and people did not recognize, say the Radak, at all that the king had been hit. He was being held up in the chariot, vayamot ba'erev, and he died at night. Vayitzek dam hamaka el chek harechev, and his blood went down inside into the chariot. Interestingly, this is actually a valiant move by Achav, and according to some in the Chazal, this was a moment of great courage that is considered very admirable. He could have run away. He could have taken care of himself. He chose not to take care of himself. Some even suggest that had he turned away, he could have lived. People would have been killed, but he could have lived, and he chose instead to take the approach of a general and stand in place. Vayavor harina b'machane, and then the rina goes through the camp. Now, rina is normally a term of joy, of jubilation. It's a song of happiness. The Targum Yonatan therefore says it's a chruz, it's a hachrazah, it was the announcement. The Radak says actually, according to the Medrash, that we have a Medrash that says, okay, that when Rishaim die, there is happiness. Or the Malbim says that he was so evil that actually, that the people rejoiced. Lahavdil elef havdalot, ding dong, the witch is dead. Okay, to use another reference for it, they're happy and they're relieved that he has died. Vayavor arina b'machane kivo hashemesh lemor, at sunset, ish al eliro v'ish el art. So everyone go home. Vayamot hamelech, and the king died. Vayavo Shomron vayikberu et melech b'Shomron, and they buried him in Shomron. Vayishtov et harechev al brechat Shomron, and they washed off the chariot by the wells, by the springs of Shomron. Vayaloku haklavim et damon, and when they washed it off, the dogs lapped up his blood. Vazonot rachatzu kedvar Hashem asher diber, fulfilling in the zonot. Now, the Zonot Rashi says this is talking about the weapons, Klei Zayin. Mitzvot says no, that these were the prostitutes. The prostitutes generally, according to the ones who were part of the service of the pagan service, according to Perek Chaf Aleph, Pasuk Yutet, this is part of the klolo that Achav gets, that these things are going to happen, and they happen. Kidvar Hashem asher diber. V'yeter divrei Achav, and all of the rest of the things of Achav, v'chol asher asa, and all that he did, uveit hashen asher bana, and also the ivory palace that he built, v'chol ha'arim asher bana, and all the cities that he built, Elohim tuvim al sefer divrei yamim lemalchei Yisrael. They are written in the chronicles of the kings of the Jewish people. Vayishkav Achav imavotav, and Achav was laid to rest with his forefathers, Vayimloch Achaziyahu v'no tachtav, and Achaziyahu, his son, took over afterwards. This is the end of the story of Achav, but it's not the end of Melachim Aleph, because Melachim Aleph now takes a turn, and it's an interesting turn that it does. And this, I believe, is why in the Datami Kraset, they chose to begin the second volume with Posuk Mem Aleph, because really, from a literary perspective, and remember, the prakim are not ours. Stephen Langton was the one who did them, Anglican priest. But the story, the literary stories, at the end of the days of Achav is the place to end. Versus the very next pasuk, which picks up V'Yoshafat ben Asa malach al Yudah b'shnat arba la'achav melech Yisrael, versus going into the story of Yehoshaphat. However, the prakim and the psukim that we have nowadays, again, it is church-based, not Jewish or in origin, even though we've adopted them. They say the parak continues for a little bit more. Yehoshaphat ben Asa, and we're now going to the south. This is Yehoshaphat, who would come up to the north, who we said was at the very least, going to be Bechutanim, may even have been the brother-in-law of Achav, who had gone to war with Achav against Aram. And according to, again, that fascinating approach within the position of Yosef ibn Yachya, he actually had been the one who killed Achav by accident. V'Yoshafat ben Asa melech al Yudah b'shnat arba la'achav melech Yisrael. So it was the 4th year of Achav's reign, where Yehoshaphat becomes the king. Achav himself, if you remember, reigned for 22 years. Yehoshaphat is going to reign for a little bit more than 23 years. Yehoshaphat ben Shloshim v'chamesh shana b'molcho. He was 35 when he became king. V'esrim v'chamesh. I'm sorry, 20. Oh yeah, I'm right. I'm sorry. I'm more. 25 years. I was wrong. I apologize. V'esrim v'chamesh shana malach b'Yerushalayim v'shem imo Azuva bat Shilchi. His mother's name was Azuva bat Shilchi. Vayelech b'chol derech Asa, and he continued in the process of Asa. Asa, we remember way back when, Asa was a king who had begun to remove idolatry. He hadn't done everything. Lo sar mimeno lasot hayashar bein Hashem. He never veered away from doing what was right. But they never removed the personal mizbachot. These personal mizbachot were always for proper use in this case. It wasn't avodah zarah, it was for God, but it shouldn't have happened. Od ha'am mezavachim mekatrim babamot. And the people are still using the bamot. The Mitzudat David says that, listen, ultimately, these were bamot that were for personal, they were bamot yachid, and all along, we wouldn't have been able to talk about Yehoshaphat doing such good things if they were used for anything else. It wasn't until the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, though, in Melachim Bet, Perek Yudchet, that we'll see that even the personal bamot in the south were going to be removed. Vayashlem Yehoshaphat im Melech Yisrael, and he had entered into a peace with the north. We saw that just a few psukim ago. Veyeter divrei Yehoshaphat u'gvurato asher asa, and all of the rest of the heroics of Yehoshaphat, everything he did, Vasher Nilcham in his battles, Halohem Tuvim al Sefer Divrei Yamim L'Malchei Yehuda. They're mentioned all in the chronicles of the kings of Yehuda, but they're also mentioned in our chronicles, in our Sefer Divrei Yamim. V'yeter HaKadesha Shenisha B'mei Asa Aviv Bi'er Min Haaretz, and all of the rest of the evil, which was the immorality from the time of Asa, Yehoshaphat had removed. This case, Rashi says, this is talking about adultery, which had become very commonplace. He got rid of the adultery from within the Jewish, which was in the southern kingdom. Umelech ein be'edom nitzav melech. And also what we know is that Edom didn't have a king. They rather had a governor who was a Jewish governor ruling over that area. Now, that little statement tells us in one fell swoop how powerful Yehoshaphat had been. Yehoshaphat had been better when it comes to God than his father, and Yehoshaphat had been more powerful and expanded the area of the Jewish hegemony. Yehoshaphat asa oniot Tarshish lalechet Ophira. And in fact, what Yehoshaphat did is he made these sea-bearing vessels to be able to go to Ophir for Zahav, v'lo halach, but they never went. With Yehoshaphat, if you think about it, he had this power to build boats, real boats. Why? But they didn't. But the ones who were going to go to Ophir, which is in Africa, never made it. Why? Ki nishberu oniot be'etzion gaver, because they had been broken in some way when they got to Etzion Gaver. Now, Etzion Gaver is a lot. It's either a lot or Aqaba or somewhere in between. It's all the way down in the south of the Negev at the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, interestingly, about all of that, if you think about it, it tells you also that his power he was able to control all of the Negev, typically where the Jewish king, where Yehuda was a little south of Beersheba. He had all the way down. He had a military power that included a naval fleet. This naval fleet didn't make it, but he had a naval fleet as well. He's a very powerful king. And the interesting piece is, Divrei Yomim explains it, that he wanted to, that what this was going to be a joint effort, this naval mission, with Achaziyahu, the son of Achav, who may have been his son-in-law. In that kind of case, he was warned actually by Eliezer ben Dudvayu that not to make this alliance, and he was told that if this will happen, it will meet with great defeat. The great defeat was the destruction of the boats on the way down. And that piece is just referenced briefly in this phrase. This is Divrei Yomim Chaf. He's actually, his story of Yehoshaphat is in Divrei Yomim Bet, from about Perek Yud Zayin into Perek Chaf already. It's a tremendous feats that he had accomplished, but this he didn't succeed. Az amar Achaziyahu ben Achav el Yehoshaphat yelchu avadayim avadecha boniot v'lo avay Yehoshaphat. And then he said, Achaziyahu, the son of Achav, says, let's try it again. He didn't do it. Vayishkav Yehoshaphat im avotav, vayikaver im avotav be'ir David aviv. And he then passes away. He's buried in Ir David, together in the royal plot. Vayimloch Yehoram benot tachtav, and Yehoram takes over for him. Achaziyahu ben Achav malach al Yisrael b'Shomron b'shnat 17 leYehoshaphat melech Yehuda. And in the 17th year, now we're going back up north. Achaziyahu takes over after the death of his father Achav. Vayimloch al Yisrael shnatayim. He only rules for 2 years. Vayasa ra b'nei Hashem, and he does what's evil in the eyes of God. Vayelech b'derech avivu b'derech imo. and he follows the approach of his father and the approach of his mother. Now, this is very unusual. Normally, we say follows in the path of his aviv or avotav. Here, it's his father and his mother, because if we remember from what we've studied, Izevel and Achav were very different personalities. Izevel was evil. Izevel was an idolater. Izevel was the one who worshipped, and Asherah, they were her own special source of avodah zarah, of pagan worship. And Izevel was the one who would do anything at any cost, and in fact, derided her husband for being weak. She was the one who made sure Navot would be killed. She was the most unscrupulous of all. That's Izevel. On the other hand, Achav was this accommodator to his wife and to others, where we keep seeing that he wants to do the right thing, and there are moments where he shines and does the right thing. Even after Har Carmel, if you remember, Eliyahu was running alongside the chariot, giving him cover, expecting him to go back and stand up, but then he doesn't. And so he follows the son. Achaziah ultimately follows in both ways. He's a combination of both parents, which is not a good combination to be. Uvederach Yeravam ben Nevat asher hechti et Yisrael. And he then also goes one step further, and he continues in the original sin of, not in a Christological sense, the original sin of the northern kingdom. The original sin of the northern kingdom was, in order to preserve power, to cause others to sin as well. So he has all of these bad things built into his DNA. Vayavodat habal, he worships Baal, vayishtachav elo, vayacheset Hashem Elokei Yisrael k'chol asher asa aviv. And he angers God in every way that his father had angered God. And with this, we end Sefer Melachim Aleph. We really go straight into Melachim Bet. There's no, if you notice the next pasuk, if you're using a Tanakh, you'll notice the next pasuk, there's no end of a paragraph, there's no difference between the two. It's right there, it just goes right, it said, Moab Yisrael achrei mot Achav. It just continues straight in. Again, another reason why that break that we have is not a Masoretic break. It's not according to the Masorah. It's a break that we use now because it became common in the world, but it's a break that really doesn't make sense in terms of the explanation of the psukim. Next week we're going to continue with this. We will, just to remind everyone that next week also, next Motzei Shabbos is Slichos already. So we will have Shir at the regular time. Yes, Rosh Hashanah is coming. It's 2 weeks from yesterday, and we will have Shir at the regular time this week. We will not have, on Rosh Hashanah, we will not have Shirs. We'll take a day off on that one. We have plenty of other things to worry about. Thank you all.